Thanks. And what's this place behind you?
This right behind us here is Founders Hall, and it's an interactive museum about Confederation as well as a tourist center. However, about 100 years ago it was actually a railway repair station. But we don't have a railway anymore, so we needed a new function for the building.
So what is the most popular question you get asked about PEI in Charlottetown?
Where did Charlottetown and PEI get its name? Without a doubt. So PEI in 1797, King George III of England decided to change it from St. John's Island, which was a direct translation from the French name here, Ile Saint-Jean, to Prince Edward Island to name it after his son Prince Edward. Charlottetown got its name because King George III also decided to make it a family affair, so he divided the island to 3 counties and each county got a capital. This here where we are, Charlottetown, is Queen's County, so he named it after his wife, Queen Charlotte. We are standing on the corner of Water and Great George Street, and these buildings behind us, the brick building next to the white one, is the oldest remaining brick building in all of Charlottetown. It dates back to 1833. It's the Gainsford House. The Gainsford House is pretty important because it stopped the Great Fire of 1857. Brick, of course, doesn't burn easily. The wooden shingles on the roof do, however, so what they did, the water used to go close to the backs of the houses. The neighbors here on Water Street took all the Gainsford's linens and drapes, went out back, dipped it in the water, put it on the roof, and saved the house. Yeah, every house had to have a ladder and 2 leather buckets full of water at all times on the premises. There are also no trees allowed within the city limits of Charlottetown. So all these trees that we see here today in Charlottetown, they're relatively recent. Well, this right now is the legal aid offices. However, when it was first built, it was actually the first bank of PEI in 1867. PEI used to be so prosperous we not only had 5 of our own banks here, we actually had our own currency as well. So there's 2 stories that go along with it. The first was in acquiring the funds for the bank. The man who went down was told to go down to Boston. There'd be some money waiting there for him. He thought it'd be in bills or paper money. It turned out to be in big gold bricks. So he got a wheelbarrow, he filled it up with the big gold bricks, he got himself enough food, drink, provisions in general to last him the 3 to 4 weeks it would take him to get back up here to PEI, at which point he locked himself in his cabin on board the ship and didn't leave once, because he did not trust anyone with those gold bricks. So some people might call it paranoia. I think if I was in a situation, I'd probably do the same thing. It's a lot of responsibility, I would say, for an entire bank. The second story that goes along with it ties into Confederation. In 1864, one reason that PEI wasn't so keen to join Confederation was because Ontario and Quebec, or Upper and Lower Canada, had just built the Grand Trunk Railway, incurred a lot of debt. Islanders didn't want to pay off a debt that wouldn't benefit them. And so in the end, in 1867, when Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia formed the first signs of what's now Canada, PEI said no. 1871, however, PEI built its own railway, ran us completely into debt. Well, we figured before we went running back to Canada, how embarrassing would that be? You know, we didn't want to pay for your railway and join your country. Now can we join your country so you can pay for ours? We thought we'd go down to the bank, see how much money there was. At which point we realized that the manager here, who was also the cashier and the teller, a bit of one of those conflicting jobs, his name was J.R. Brecken. He'd been keeping 2 sets of books. Well, he realized he was in a great deal of trouble. He ran down to New Brunswick, later made his way to Baltimore, at which point he wrote his wife a letter and said, "I'm not coming back anytime soon." And that was pretty much the end of Mr. Brecken and a lot of our money here on PEI. So 1873, PEI has no choice but to join Confederation because Canada says, "Come over here, we'll pay off your railway debt, don't worry about it." Right behind us, this is the Bishop's Palace. It was built in 1875 for the Bishop Peter McIntyre. Actually, when it was built, not only was it not black, there were also no trees around it. Once again, following with the rule of no trees in the city limits of Charlottetown, so it would have looked quite a bit more intimidating at the time.
So what makes the building black?
It's actually an oxidation process. There's a lot of salt in the air here. The high salt content actually rusts the stones. These are Miramichi freestones imported from New Brunswick, and so it's actually just a rust process. You can clean it off, but it'll come back eventually. Some people say that it's actually a pollution process, but if you go and you touch the stones, if you rub it, it actually won't come off, which proves that it's rust. This right behind us is St. Dunstan's Basilica, and it's actually the 4th St. Dunstan's to exist. The first was a small wooden chapel built around 1815. It burnt down because it was made of wood. They decided they'd build up another one. However, at this point they realized they'd already made it and it was made of wood. They thought, in case there's another fire, maybe we should have a stone one. So they were going to move the wooden church aside and they'd still have services in there while they built up the stone one. However, the way you'd move buildings back then is you'd move them with horses and logs. One of the horses got spooked, jumped up, log rolled out, church came crashing down. So the joke, of course, is that horses can run down Great George Street just fine. Churches have a little bit more difficulty. So they completed the stone church over here, but although stone doesn't burn well, the wooden interior certainly did. So they, in the end, had to build a fourth St. Dunstan's, although a lot of what we see here today is from the third, and the fourth was actually completed in 1919. So if you lived to be the ripe old age of 104, you could have been baptized and had your funeral in the first and the last St. Dunstan's. And in 1929, it was raised to the status of a basilica. In fact, the spires at the top of it, not only did the trees used to be as tall as the spires of St. Dunstan's, which is one of the reasons we had such a great shipbuilding industry here in the 19th century, it's also the tallest point by law in all of Charlottetown.
Do you believe in angels?
I certainly do, and I'd have to, because there are over 300 inside St. Dunstan's over here. Of course, they're not floating around. They're gold ones mounted on the wall. So we have a saying here on PEI, if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes. So if perhaps it's a little bit rainy while you're here, you can go inside, play a bit of a Where's Waldo game, see how many angels you can count while you're walking around Charlottetown. The Great George Hotel actually encompasses not only this block, but a lot of the houses around it. It's part of a group of hotels called the Inns on Great George. However, each of these buildings had their own story back in the 19th century. What is now the lobby of the Great George Hotel, it used to actually be called the Pavilion, and this is where the New Brunswick delegates would have stayed in 1864 for the Charlottetown Conference. The Canadians, that's to say from Upper and Lower Canada, actually had to sleep on their steamship, the Queen Victoria, because there were no vacancies in any of the hotels. So John A. Macdonald slept on a boat while he was here in Charlottetown. This blue building behind us is the Wellington. It's actually the oldest building on all of Great George Street. It was built in 1811, but that's not the reason it's so important. It's important because it was a bar. And it actually had itself a bit of a nickname. It was called Howell's Parliament because John Howell was the owner. It said that politicians spent more time at the Wellington than up at the Colonial Building. This building is the Witter Coombs house. It was actually John Howell, the owner of the Wellington's granddaughter's home, and she was actually a candle maker. Now, although I suppose candle making isn't the most prosperous endeavor today, she was quite wealthy. There are so many churches in all of Charlottetown, as well as gaslighting only came into play in the late 1860s. She sold quite a good deal of candles, and in fact, probably unbeknownst to her, her candles started quite a few of the fires here in Charlottetown.
What about the Great Fire?
Great Fire, the 1866, they ran for 3 days straight. We're not quite sure, but it could very well have been her candles once again. In fact, George Coles, an island politician, is said to have lost his mind because he spent 3 days straight without food, drink, or any sleep trying to fight the fire.
So that's kind of an odd sidewalk.
Yeah, it's part of the oldest sidewalk in all of Charlottetown. It dates back to the early 1900s. Hasn't been replaced yet, and that's because each of these stones goes 6 feet into the ground.
6 feet?
Yeah, Charlottetown had no sidewalks, red mud and hemlock planks, and so islanders decided, well, we'll splurge, we'll import the stones from Nova Scotia. They came in these big 6-foot blocks, so islanders dug the holes and set the stones in, at which point it only covered about 2.5 blocks. They finally waited and waited. They sent a letter to Nova Scotia. They said, where's the rest of our stones? And Nova Scotia said, well, that's it. You were supposed to cut them into slabs to cover all of Charlottetown, which apparently islanders didn't know. Now, other people say that islanders weren't that oblivious. They actually did know they were supposed to cut them into slabs, but that the tools they had to import were from England. They were so expensive, in the end, islanders decided to forget about it. So either way, you can decide if islanders were clueless or just cheap, but still, we only had red mud and hemlock planks with 2.5 blocks of very pristine stone sidewalks. These brick buildings right behind us are part of what's called Hart's O'Halloran Row. They were built up between 1859 and 1879, so a 20-year span. However, the story that goes along with them is actually about 100 years later. In the 1970s, these were actually the slums of Charlottetown, and it was said, you know, if you wanted to be harassed, walk right down here, which is pretty odd since Great George Street is definitely one of the nicest streets in all of Charlottetown now. That's because it's a heritage street. So in the late 1970s, early 1980s, there was a great movement here in Charlottetown to, especially with Great George Street, make it, you know, more of a heritage site. And so these buildings were restored. They had to, you know, get everyone who was in welfare housing inside here out. And most people were pretty compliant. No, they were all right with moving out, except for one elderly lady. She refused to move. And so the official said, well, you know, this is going to become heritage housing. We really do need you to get out of here. You can't live here anymore. To which she replied, heritage me arse. So there was a big movement. There are actually Heritage Me Arse t-shirts made up, so if you can find any while you're here in Charlottetown, you should definitely snatch it up. I've been looking for one for years, and I still can't find one. This right here is Province House. It's the provincial legislature or legislative assembly here on PEI. Although it looks pretty small to be our legislative assembly, PEI only has about 142,000 people on the entire island, so it still serves its purpose pretty well. Well, the best story is without a doubt the Proclamation of Confederation. Now, when it was built in 1847, it was a government project, so the budget got cut by quite a bit. There was I guess no money for the wings or the balcony. The balcony was added on a little bit later. They gave them another £11,000, said build us something nicer. There's still evidence that the balcony was added on later because there's no railing and there's no door to get out there. So in 1873, when Confederation was announced to the people here in Charlottetown, the gentleman who made the proclamation actually had to climb up through the window